Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'd like to thank Lola for warming you up, talking about sex. But for that rather wonderful, sobering, but a wonderful catalyst for a debate. I think I will try to try and do the same thing. We all have light bulb moments, you know, those kind of ahas where you go, this is probably going to change my tomorrow, or my next week, or my next year, sometimes the rest of your life. I'd like to take you through a few of mine. I promise you it won't be too long. My first one was when I was about 12, and I was watching the seminal Roots program on the TV, and it was the moment when, of course, Kunta Kinte said, "My name is Kunta," as he was being whipped. "No, your name is Toby." "No, it is Kunta." It was probably at that point that a seed, a lifelong seed, was placed in my mind. That seed that told me that although I am of direct West Indian descent, that although everything that I was told, particularly at that time about Africa, was negative, that I was an African. It was placed in my mind at about 12. And then the next one was when I was about 18, and I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Now, of course, the startling thing about that was that I realized that 1950s racism in America looked a lot like 1980s and 90s racism in Britain, but it actually was his description of the conch, of the African-American men at that time combing their hair back through great pain in order to make it straight and look like their white peers, that made me have to cut off my Jerry curl. I loved my Jerry curl. But hey, had to go. The next one was, I was about 23. You can see there is no kind of numerical sequence to this. It just jumps all over the place. But the rest, I was about 23, and it was the birth of my first child. And I had never could never have imagined that love ran that deep. But the ones I want to talk to you about today are probably the last two. I was at a party at a very wonderful friend of mine called Matthew Ryder, QC, a great barrister, and we were talking about role models and the role models of our youth and you know, what they did to us. And he said something. He said, "Do you realize that the Malcolms and the Martin Luther Kings, that they were dead before the age that we are now?" That was the other thing, actually, the light bulb moment. I realized that I was middle-aged. And that kind of shook me a little bit, but it was his following statements that really got to me. And he said, "Don't you think, though, that we should be holding as our role models in equal esteem the people who have built something?" Now, that's not to anyway negate what Martin and Malcolm did. They built movements from the ground up, things that have affected the qualities of our lives across the continent, throughout the diaspora. But something physical. I mean, it's really easy for any red-blooded young male to kind of want to do what they did. Fight the power, dismantle forms of oppression. You feel like you're being a man when you're doing those things. But what about the role models, the people who built things, built something physically? That, of course, began a big bit of soul-searching for me. I began to look around in Britain at people in my sphere, in my field, who have built something that you could drive by, something that your children could drive by in 50 years and say, "My mother, my father built that. They were instrumental in making that what it is." Even if the property was no longer there, even if the physical thing was no longer there, they could say standing right there was. I was pleased to say that there was one of my peers, a wonderful man called Tunde Banjoko, who had started an organization called LEAP, which was about getting the long-term unemployed back into employment. But he also had that was the philosophy, but they also had their building, something that symbolized that leap forward. But when I looked at my own life, at what I had built, I began to struggle. Within my acting career, what have I built? I wouldn't count that. Within my writing career, my broadcasting career, sure, yes, I have left documents behind. I have reflected my community in works of art and hoped that they would be catalysts for debates to change things. But what had I physically built? I'm a profound believer in the power of not complaining. I actually landed on the plane yesterday, and the very first thing I heard was a very quintessential British couple moaning about not just the weather, but how long it took us to get to the terminal and how long, and I went, yep, I'm home. I pride myself on challenging that instinct that has been placed in us here. My second thing is that I'm a profound believer in the power of asking. Now, no matter what you believe in, I believe in there is something greater than myself and asking of that greater power. Now, I was very fortunate. About 6 months after this kind of existential angst began, I was offered, as referred, the artistic directorship of the World Festival of Black Arts and Culture in Senegal, Dakar. And, you know, the first one, for those who may not know it, was set up directly after the independence movements swept Africa. And it was there, really, to say to itself and to say to the world that Africa was built on millennia of art. It's not just the things that you might just see at the British Museum or the pictures that you might see on the movies, but actually that it was built on something, that art was right at the root of our culture, and progressive art was right at the root of our culture. The second one in Nigeria was about saying, let us now celebrate our freeness. Let us now celebrate that we don't have to stick to an ideology. And so we were really, really convinced that this third festival should be about asking the big question, where will Africa be at the end of the 21st century? Through the prism of art, how can we find ourselves equal, if not surpassing, many of the nations in the developing world? Because when I looked at the art and the field of art, in all of the disciplines, and we had 16 disciplines in that festival, in all of those disciplines, world leaders, not defined by their race, not defined even by their geographical locations, but world leaders from architecture through to contemporary art, were of direct African descent. Many people thought I was absolutely crazy when I agreed to join the festival and lead it. We had about 4 months to go, and there was nothing. And we built it. We built it, and no matter what the scandals there were before, and the scandals during, and the scandals after, we built something. We constructed a ship that asked those questions both cerebrally and artistically, that merged the two of those things together. And as I stood in the Senghor Stadium at the opening ceremony, filled with 40,000 people, and I looked at the international work that I had created, and 1,000 dancers, huge screens, and I found myself in Britain almost, and I don't say relegated because I thank Britain for many of the things it has given me, but I found myself almost having to write about the domestic rather than the international. That there was an audience for the internal black struggle or the internal black criticism, but not necessarily an audience that allowed one to explore the bigger things. I found myself at once filled with huge pride that I was able to be a part of this, that I was able to lead it. But also I found myself probably at my lowest ebb. Because I realized, I think at that point, that I, like many of my actor friends who had escaped to America because of the perceived glass ceiling in the art, because many of my business friends had gone back to Nigeria or gone back to the motherland because if they could get bank loans, they were being charged higher levels of interest. That maybe this diasporian African here at this point in time had fulfilled his potential here and had to go somewhere else. Now, there is something in the genes of the African, there is something certainly in the gene of the African Caribbean, that the sea plays a vital part in the travel, the constant movement. And it was with that understanding and that sadness that my second prayer or request was answered. I was offered to be the artistic director of one of America's leading theaters, Center Stage in Baltimore, the State Theatre of Maryland. And I did the thing that I thought I would never do. I did the thing that when all of my friends said, listen, we've got to go to America, we've got to go. I said, no, we've got to build here. We've got to stand, we've got to do something. I left. I went on that journey. I tell you, it's a very strange thing. How many people in here might call themselves, classify themselves loosely and as an immigrant? Good. Your papers will be checked in a moment. Because it's a profound thing. Just as I got comfortable in the country of my birth, just when my country started to see me as part of it and not telling me to go back to where I came from, just as a land warmed up to the possibility of fulfilling and tapping black potential, I left. I felt that I had hit that glass ceiling. It's a weird thing as well, being an immigrant. It's that thing of how much time you spend in your day catching up with what was happening in the old country. Yeah, I know you know that one. Plus trying to catch up what's happening in the new country. That insecurity of saying the things that you would naturally say at home, something that might be critical of your country, something that might be the thing that you would just go, and then you think, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't quite say that in this company. Yes, there are more immigrants in here than people put their hands up to. It is a bizarre feeling, but you also get that sense. And it is as a father that you see it even more, as a mother that you see it even more. You see the sense of opportunity through the lens of your children. I began to see what my mother and what my father, who came from the island of Grenada, must have seen when they looked at me and they looked at my brothers and my sisters and they looked at the life that we were living and the opportunities that we were having. That sense of being an immigrant, I tell you, it really hit me hard. But the real cost was that within a month of going, within a month of trying to reconcile, Kwame, you are going so you can redefine in your mind what the 21st century African is. As grand as that sounds. Within a month, riots broke out in Britain. My beloved city was in flames. The thing that contributed to the artist that I am today, the thing that helped to mold me into the man that I am today, yes, with faults, but pleased with the things that has been placed in me. The flames started to burn. I can't tell you how painful it was for me to wake up every morning and just go to the Guardian website. Am I allowed to say that? Sorry. Or go to the BBC. I mean, tears would I'm not lying, I'm not trying to self-aggrandize, but tears would run as I read about the community that I came from being blamed, being called feral, being told that they are contaminating white youth. There's tears of rage and anger hit me as I was 4,000 miles away trying to make a better life for myself and my children, and my community was burning. And of course, I wanted to just jump and get back on the plane, not because I thought that I would make a difference, not because I thought that anything would change, but I just wanted to hold a broom. I just wanted to be part of that cleanup. I just wanted to contribute. I just wanted to be on Newsnight cursing down the man that made us feel bad. But I wasn't. I was there, and I was this close to coming home, but I didn't. And I didn't because I realized that all of my role models, all of them, were formed around the premise of fighting the power, of going to the status quo and arguing with them. That my manhood, my own sense of man, was based around how I could fight, not how I could build. That was so deeply imbued in my mind, fighting as being, as contributing, as contribution, not what have I built. And so I stayed. And I resisted, more importantly, the impulse to just jump on the plane and land and come and just be. And so the question is to myself, and the challenge is to myself, and the question that I'd like to throw out to you, this diasporian African audience, and the greater world who may be looking at this online, is how do we construct the 21st century role model? How do we move beyond the 20th century role model, standing on what they did, but how do we form it? And many may ask the question that we are, or many may say, we are still in the early parts of this century. It's still being formed, it's still flowing, it's still ebbing and moving. And I would say that's even more reason why we should ask the question, why we should begin to create the parameters for the 21st century role model, even if it means defeating the notion of the role model. And here I'm willing to contradict myself, or even just show my default. Because when I started to think about this, what did I do? I went back to that other Caribbean. I went back and looked, and I saw Marcus Garvey at this time a century ago, getting on his ship and coming to England to learn the tools of the trade by which to go to America, to then build an organization that wasn't just about fighting the power, was much about self-determination and self-sufficiency, as much about the businesses, as much about owning the ships that sailed to the motherland and back. Something that was both literal and metaphoric. He was already forming his strategies. He was already building his movements. So as I look down at the screen and it says I have 1 minute left, I leave you with this question. We must find, develop, ask the questions that will allow our children and our grandchildren to rip them down, to stand on stages and say, we must move beyond that. They will only see further because they would have stood on the shoulders of giants. Fight the power.